Marcus Dean follows a crying toddler in a grocery store. What he discovers changes. Glow stories. On a snowy night in a quiet Pennsylvania town, what started as a simple grocery run turned into something no one could have predicted. When Marcus Dean, a man known for his calm strength, spotted a crying little girl alone by the freezer aisle, he thought he was stepping in to help a lost child. But what he uncovered behind those cold metal doors would shake the very soul of the community and lead to a truth no one saw coming. Stay with us because this isn't just a story about a missing parent. It's a chilling descent into something far darker and far more real. The small town of Blackstone sat in the heart of rural Pennsylvania, nestled between snow-capped mountains and wide, barren fields. The grocery store at the edge of town had always been a haven for locals, a place where neighbors crossed paths and the smell of fresh bread and coffee permeated the air. No, but tonight as a heavy snowstorm began to brew outside, the store seemed eerily quiet. The snowflakes danced against the cold glass windows and making the world outside appear as if it were fading into oblivion. Inside the supermarket's bright lights flickered slightly, casting long shadows on the linoleum floors. A soft hum echoed from the refrigerator aisles, and the steady ticking of the clock behind the counter was the only sound breaking the silence. Shaquille, Big Shaq. Carter, a towering figure of muscle and confidence, pushed his cart slowly down the aisle. He was the kind of person who exuded a quiet sense of authority, his eyes always scanning the room, always aware of his surroundings, with a thick winter coat wrapped around his broad shoulders. He looked more like a giant than a man, and his calm demeanor was the kind that made others trust him without hesitation. It was a rare sight for Shaq to be in the store at this hour, but with the storm approaching, he decided to grab a few essentials before hunkering down at home. He wandered down the A's, lost in thought. When something caught his eye, a small figure stood at the far end of the aisle by the frozen food section. A little girl, no more than 6 or 7, in a bright red coat that almost seemed out of place against the dull, harsh lighting of the supermarket. Her small bare feet were barely making a sound as she wandered, her face pale with fear. Her long hair was disheveled, and her eyes, wide and glassy, glistened with tears. Shaw's heart dropped. He wasn't one to shy away from difficult situations, but there was something unsettling about the scene. The girl seemed so out of place, so alone, no parent in sight. No one even glanced. Her way, the store was almost empty, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. His instincts kicked in as he made his way toward her. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He knew every instinct in his body was telling him to approach cautiously, but this was a child, he couldn't leave her here. "Hey there, little one." Shaq's deep voice rumbled softly. As he knelt down to her level, the girl didn't answer right away, just staring at him with a mix of fear and something darker in her eyes. Shaq gave her a reassuring smile, trying to break the ice. "Are you lost?" he asked, his voice warm but filled with an undercurrent of concern. Finally, she blinked, as if pulling herself from some deep, hidden place. Her voice came out as a whisper, trembling but clear. "He took Mommy," she said, her small hands clutching her red coat tighter. She pointed down the aisle toward the back of the store, where the industrial freezer doors loomed like silent giants. In the distance, Shaw's heart skipped a beat. He stood up, his eyes following her gaze, the freezer section. "What do you mean, sweetheart? Who took your mommy?" he asked, his voice lowering, a sense of urgency beginning to rise in his chest. The girl's face crumpled as she took a shaky breath. "He took Mommy into the freezer," she whispered, as if saying it out loud made the nightmare more real. "Please don't let him get her again." A chill ran through Shaq's spine. The girl's words didn't make sense. Why would someone take a child's mother into the freezer section of a store, and who would be crazy enough to do something like that? He didn't have time to think about it too long. The girl's eyes were wild now, her small hands gripping his jacket tightly. Her breath was quick and shallow. Hey, it's okay," Shaq said, gently guiding her towards the customer service desk. We'll figure this out. Okay, we'll find your mom. I promise. As they reached the desk, Shaw noticed the store clerk, Trevor, leaning against the counter, lazily staring at his phone. He looked up at the sight of the girl, but his gaze quickly flicked away as he scowled. Something wrong? Shaq asked, his voice a little sharper now. Trevor didn't look up. Nah, man. Just a kid probably lost her parents or something. We'll announce it over the loudspeakers, he muttered, distracted. But Lila Shaq had learned her name. In the moments after speaking to her didn't seem reassured. Her tiny fingers dug into Shaw's jacket as if her very life depended on it. No! She cried, her voice. Desperate, he's going to take Mommy again. Please don't let him. Shaq's instincts flared. Something wasn't right. This wasn't a simple case of a lost child. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him, growing heavier by the second. I'm just stay here, Shaq told Nora before turning back toward the back of the store. The freezer doors loomed ahead, cold, and silent as he walked down the aisle. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He was certain of one thing now. Whatever was happening here, it was far more dangerous than he'd first imagined, and he wasn't about to walk away without answers. Shaq's boots echoed on the linoleum as he moved briskly toward the back of the store. The fluorescent lights above buzzed softly, casting a flickering glow that made the whole place feel even more unnerving. Nora's grip tightened on his jacket, her small fingers barely making an impact against the thick fabric of his coat. But the fear radiating from her was undeniable. They reached the customer service counter, and Shaq glanced back toward Trevor, who was still looking at his phone, oblivious to the rising tension around him. Shaw's eyes narrowed the situation, slowly starting to feel more off. With every passing second, the store, which had been so welcoming and familiar to the townsfolk, now seemed like a maze of shadows and cold corners, hiding secrets that no one wanted to confront. Nora's whisper still lingered in the air, a haunting echo of what she'd said he took Mommy. Shaw's mind raced. Who was he, and what did it mean to take someone into the freezer? He tried to calm the growing pit in his stomach, but there was something about Nora's terror that felt all too real. He couldn't shake the image of a man dragging her mother into the freezer section. It didn't make sense, but every part of Shaq's gut screamed that it wasn't a mere accident. He crouched down in front of Nora, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. Her wide, tear-filled eyes met his, and he could see the fear etched into every line of her face. Lila, he said softly, I need you to stay calm, okay? We're going to figure this out. I'm going to help you find your mom. I promise. She nodded shakily, but the fear didn't fade. He clung to her like a shadow he took Mommy. She repeated, her voice breaking. He said he would hurt her. If I told anyone, Shaq's heart sank as he processed her words. This wasn't just an innocent misunderstanding. This was something darker. Nora's words painted a picture of a calculated threat. And the more he thought about it, the more certain he became that they were dealing with something much more sinister than a lost child. I need to talk to someone who works here, Shaq muttered. Glancing around, the store's small customer service area was empty except for Trevor, who still hadn't moved. Trevor, Shaw said more firmly, walking over to the counter. We need to talk to someone in charge. Now Trevor finally looked up, his lazy expression quickly replaced by a small, frustrated frown. What is it now? He asked, his voice barely masking the irritation in it. You still want to make an announcement? The kid's probably just lost, man. Shaq's patience was wearing thin. This isn't just a lost kid, he said, his voice low but urgent. Her mother's missing and something's going on here. We need to do more than just make an announcement. We need to find her. Trevor rolled his eyes but reluctantly put down his phone. All right, fine, I'll get Mr. Caldwell. The mention of the store manager's name did nothing to reassure Shaq. He knew Mr. Caldwell was a stickler for rules, but something told him that rules weren't going to cut it tonight, as Trevor disappeared to find the manager. Shaq looked down at Lila. She was still trembling, her wide eyes darting toward the back of the store, toward the freezers. Stay here, Shaq told her gently. Though it felt like a weak reassurance, he didn't want to leave her alone, but he had to figure out what was going on before it got worse. Shaq made his way toward the back of the store, toward the industrial freezers where Nora had pointed the aisles grew quieter the further he went, and the dim light from the freezer section seemed to cast an eerie glow across the entire store. A strange unease hung in the air, as if the very walls were holding their breath. When he reached the freezer doors, Shaq paused, scanning the area around him. Everything seemed so ordinary, too. Ordinary he could hear the faint hum of the refrigerators and freezers, the low buzz of the overhead lights, and the faint sound of footsteps in the distance, but something in the air felt thick with tension. He instinctively glanced behind him, half expecting to see someone watching him, but the aisles remained empty as he stepped closer to the freezers. His eyes were drawn to a set of wet footprints, leading away from the cold, gleaming metal doors. At first, he thought it was just the melting snow from outside, but the footprints weren't big enough. They were small, almost childlike, yet far too big for Nora's feet, and they seemed to lead in the direction of the back hallway toward the employee, only section Shaq's heart began to race. His instincts were telling him something was wrong, deeply wrong, and it wasn't just the footprints. It was the way the store felt, the way the air seemed to close in around him as he moved farther down the hallway. There was a heaviness to the silence, a sense that something or someone, was waiting. He wasn't alone. As he moved further into the hallway, he heard the sound of voices. Faintly ahead, Shaq stiffened his hand instinctively, reaching for his phone, ready to call for backup if necessary, but as he moved toward the voices, he froze when he heard a familiar name, Shaq. He turned to find Sierra, one of the store employees, standing at the far end of the hallway. She looked tense, almost nervous, her hands wringing together as she glanced around, her eyes darting between Shaq and the rest of the store. "Everything okay?" Shaq asked, his voice low but probing. Sierra swallowed, hard shaking her head. "Yeah, I'm fine, yeah. Just, making sure everything's in order?" Shaw narrowed his eyes. There was something off about her. Her voice wavered and she was sweating. Despite the cold of the hallway, he took a step closer. "You know anything about the missing woman or the kid?" Sierra hesitated for a moment, then let out a nervous laugh. "I don't know anything, honestly. You should just talk to Trevor or Mr. Caldwell." But if Shaq began to walk away, he caught the faint sound of Sierra's voice, whispering into her walkie-talkie, "We've got a problem." Shaq's blood ran cold. There was more going on here than she was letting on, and that meant he had to dig deeper. Shaq's thoughts raced as he stood there, the echo of Sierra's whispered words still hanging in the air. "We've got a problem." Something about the way she said it, almost like an order, not a observation, sent a cold shiver down his spine. Whatever was happening, it was more than a simple missing person case. It was something bigger, something much darker. Lila, the little girl, had gone silent behind him, and Shay quickly turned his attention back to her. She clung to his side, her small fingers trembling in the fabric of his jacket. Her wide eyes were locked on the freezer doors, and her gaze flickered between the dark, cold shadows ahead and the quiet aisles behind them. "I'm going to get you some help," Shay reassured her softly, even as his gut twisted in knots. He knew deep down that this wasn't going to end as easily as he had hoped. There were too many things happening at once, too many pieces of the puzzle he hadn't yet put together. Leading Nora by the hand, Shaw turned and started back toward the customer service area. The closer they got, the more Shaq's mind raced with questions. Sierra's strange behavior, the wet footprints, and now Nora's insistence that her mother had been taken into the freezer. It all pointed to something. More than just a missing person. Someone had planned this, and they weren't going to let anyone get in the way of their plans. As they reached the customer service desk, Shaw saw Trevor leaning lazily against the counter, still scrolling on his phone as if nothing was wrong. The lack of urgency and his demeanor was starting to bother Shaq. Didn't he realize the gravity of the situation? Trevor Shaq said firmly, his voice cutting through the haze of tension that had settled over the store. You need to get someone who knows what's going on. Now Trevor looked up clearly. Uninterested, man. I told you I'll make an announcement. It's just a lost kid. All right? Not just a lost kid. Shaq shot back, his voice sharp. Her mother's missing and someone took her into the freezer section. Now get me Mr. Caldwell, or someone who knows what the hell is going on. Trevor sighed, rolling his eyes. Fine, I'll go get him, he muttered, clearly irritated, before shuffling away to the back office. Shaq watched him go, his eyes narrowing every minute they wasted. Here was another minute that Nora's mother could be in danger with a soft tug, Shaw LED. Nora away from the counter and toward the back hallway, he wasn't about to wait for Trevor or Mr. Caldwell to figure this out. He was going to find Nora's mother on, and R himself stay close. Shaq murmured to Lila, who was clinging to his side. We're going to find her, all right. I'm not leaving until we do. They passed the aisles of frozen food, the industrial freezers blooming large and cold in the dimly lit aisle as they approached the back of the store. Chuck's eyes scanned the area for any sign of movement, any clue that could explain what was happening. The wet footprints were still there, leading toward the employee-only section, and they looked recent, fresh. Even a cold draft filled the air, and Shaw's breath came out in small puffs as he continued to follow the trail. He had to be careful now. Something told him, this wasn't just a run-of-the-mill abduction. Whoever was behind this knew the store inside and out, and they had no intention of getting caught. Shaq's footsteps were soft against the tile. As he moved further down the hallway, he could hear his heart beating in his ears, the steady thump of adrenaline pulsing through his veins. His eyes darted between the flickering overhead lights and the shadows lurking at the edges of the hallway. It felt like the walls were closing in on him. The tension was palpable, suffocating as he neared the back storage area. The trail of footprints led to a small door on the left, partially hidden behind a stack of cardboard boxes. The door was cracked open just enough for Shaq to see the faint outline of something inside. A low hum, like an old air conditioning unit, reverberated from within. The air was cold here, colder than the rest of the store. Jack hesitated for a moment, his instinct screaming at him to be careful, but there was no turning back now. He needed to find answers, stepping closer. He gently pushed the door open, the creak of the hinges sounding louder than he wanted inside the dim lighting. See long, eerie shadows across the room. Shaw's eyes immediately went to the floor, where more wet footprints marked the path toward a set of industrial shelves. He took a deep breath, his hand gripping the edge of the doorframe as he stepped inside. He was about to turn when something caught his eye. A small object on the floor. He crouched down to examine it. A phone. A woman's phone by the looks of it. Shaq's heart sank. It was cracked at the corner as if it had been dropped hastily. He reached for it, turning it over in his hands. Nora gasped softly beside him. "That's Mommy's phone," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Shaq looked at the phone in his hands and his stomach turned. He had to keep moving. He couldn't let himself be distracted. Now Nora's mother could be just around the corner, or worse, in the freezer section. Still with a determined nod to Lila, Shaq moved further into the room behind the shelves. The space seemed to stretch further than he expected. As his eyes adjusted to the dim lighting, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A tuft of dark hair, tangled and caught on the edge of a shelf, as was all that remained of the woman who had been dragged into this place. Nora's face, her little hands trembling against Shaq's jacket. "That's Mommy's hair," she whispered. Shaw's pulse quickened. This was no coincidence. Someone had taken her mother, and they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted, but Shaq wasn't about to let that happen. He wrapped his arm around Lila, pulling her close, as he steeled himself for whatever came next. "We're not leaving without her," Shaq said firmly. He wasn't sure how much longer they had, But one thing was for certain, he wasn't going to let this nightmare claim any more victims. Shu's grip on Nora's small hand tightened as he moved quickly through the back hallway of the store. The dim light from the overhead bulbs barely illuminated the path, casting long, jagged shadows against the walls. The cold air seemed to grow thicker with each step, and the weight of the situation pressed down on him like a heavy stone. Every instinct in his body screamed a hurry to find Nora's mother before it was too late. As he approached the employee only section of the store, he glanced over at Lila, whose face was pale with fear. Her wide eyes flickered from one shadow to the next, as if she were trying to avoid something she couldn't see. Her small body was tense against him, her steps hesitant. "It's going to be all right," Jack reassured her softly, though even he wasn't sure if he believed his own words. The situation had escalated too quickly for comfort, and every second that pass felt like a ticking time bomb. They reached the hallway that led to the employee break room, and Shaq could hear voices coming from inside. At first they were low murmurs, nothing more than faint murmurs that bounced off the walls. But as he drew closer, he could make out words nervous, almost frantic-sounding words. Did you hear? She's asking about the freezer. What if someone's what? If she's already, called the cops?" The voice was unmistakable. It was Sierra. The tone of her voice was all wrong, shaky, filled with anxiety, and there was an edge of panic buried in the words. Shaq stopped in his tracks, listening carefully. The other voice, a deeper one, followed. "Sierra's words, I don't know, but you need to stay calm if he finds out we told anyone." There was a pause, a long, tense silence that had Shaw straining to hear more. Then the conversation resumed, and Sierra's voice shook as she spoke. "It's too late, he's already here, he knows we're on to him." Shaw's stomach twisted. Something was going terribly wrong, and it was all too clear that Sierra wasn't just a frightened employee. She knew more than she was letting on. She wasn't just scared, she was involved. He stepped back quietly, pulling Lila into the shadows with him, careful not to alert anyone inside the break room. Shaw's mind raced. Sierra's nervousness, her strange behavior earlier, the whisper into of the walkie-talkie. It was all starting to make sense. She wasn't acting like someone who was. Unaware of the situation, she was complicit. He turned to Nora. "Stay right here. I need you to be quiet." He whispered, his voice firm but gentle. The girl nodded, her eyes wide with fear. She was shaking, but there was a glimmer of trust in her expression. She knew Shaq was trying to help her. Without waiting for another moment, Shaq slipped quietly through the shadows back into the hallway, and he moved with a purpose. Now a new determination in his step. He needed to get to the bottom of this before it spiraled even further out of control. Shah made his way back toward the main floor of the store, his mind working through the possibilities. Sierra's words had told him everything he needed to know. There was more at play here than just an abduction. The mention of heat. The man who had taken Nora's mother wasn't just some random stranger. It was someone who had connections in the store, someone with access to areas they shouldn't have. And now it seemed like the employees knew more than they were letting on. As Shaq walked past the shelves of frozen goods, his mind spun with questions. Who was the man they were talking about? And why was Sierra so desperate to cover for him? He wasn't going to let them escape without answers. Before he could get too far, he spotted Trevor again, this time, talking with another employee near the front of the store. Shaq recognized the man immediately. Miguel, a new hire who had only been with the store for a few weeks. Miguel had always seemed polite enough, but Shaq had never really had a chance to talk to him, beyond the occasional nod. Miguel saw Shaq approaching and gave him a nervous smile, but Shaq could see the unease in his eyes. Something was off. "Miguel," Shaq said, his voice low but firm. "I need to ask you something. You knew anything about the freezer, about the woman who was taken?" Miguel shifted on his feet, glancing at Trevor, who had gone quiet at the sound of Shaw's voice. There was a flicker of something aguilt, maybe in Miguel's eyes, before he looked back at Shaq. Miguel hesitated, wiping his hand across his forehead. His face flushed as he glanced down at his shoes. Shaw could sense the hesitation in his voice. I saw something earlier. I saw a guy, probably a delivery driver, dragging a woman into the freezer, but I didn't do anything. My boss, he told me not to get involved. Shaw's eyes widened as Miguel spoke. His mind raced, piecing together the pieces of the puzzle. A delivery driver. No one had mentioned anyone from outside. The store. And now it sounded like Miguel had seen the entire thing. You saw him? Shaw asked, his voice urgent. Now what did he look like? Did you see his face? Miguel swallowed hard, his eyes darting between Sheik and Trevor. I didn't get a good look, but he had a burn scar on his neck, and he was wearing a delivery jacket. I don't know much else, man. I didn't think it was a big deal, but now I don't know, something's wrong. A burn scar. Shaw's mind locked onto that detail. He had seen a man earlier, a man who fit the description of the abductor, and it seemed like everything was starting to fall into place. The man Miguel had seen, the strange behavior from Sierra, and now the trail that led directly to the freezer. Shaw's thoughts raced. They had a name now, the man in the delivery jacket with a burn scarf. He was involved? But what was his connection to the store? Why hadn't anyone else reported it? Why was Sierra trying so hard to cover it up? Shaq took a deep breath, pushing the frustration down. He needed answers. He needed them now. I'm going to need you to tell me everything you know about this guy. Shaq said, his voice calm but filled with authority. Every detail. Where did you see him? What time was it? Miguel nodded. Swallowing hard, it was around 600 p.m. He came in with a dolly, like he was making a delivery. I thought, maybe it was just a routine drop-off. But then I saw him dragging her into the freezer. I didn't think to say anything until now. But if you're right, and this is something serious, then I'm sorry, man. I should have told someone sooner. It's not too late, Shaw said firmly. We're going to fix this, but I need your help. Miguel nodded again, the fear in his eyes slowly turning into something more resolute. He was ready to do what was right. Shaq could only hope it was in time. Shaw's pulse thudded in his ears as he listened to Miguel's recount of the delivery man dragging Nor's mother into the freezer. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the deeper he got, the more dangerous the situation became. He could feel the weight of the tension pressing down on him, like the storm outside, quiet, but on the verge of breaking. Miguel's description of the man with the burn scar was burned into his mind. It matched the figure he had glimpsed earlier in the store, someone who clearly didn't belong, someone who was hiding in plain sight. But now they were up against the clock. Nor's mother could still be in that freezer, vulnerable and scared, and every second spent talking was another second that might be too late. Miguel, you need to stay here. Shaw Inster struck his voice low and commanding. If anyone comes by, I need you to tell them what you saw, understand? Miguel nodded, his face pale but determined. I'm not going anywhere, man. Want to help, good, Shaw said, clapping him on the shoulder briefly. He turned to Lila, whose small hand was still tightly clutching his jacket. Her eyes were wide with fear, and for the first time Shaq realized how much this little girl had been through. She wasn't just scared of the dark. She was terrified of losing her mother. Stay close to me, all right? Shaq whispered to her, his voice soft but resolute. We're going to find your mom. I promise. Lila nodded, but the worry in her eyes didn't go away. She had witnessed to enough horror for one night, when and Shaq was all too aware that the worst wasn't over yet, with no time to waste. Shaq turned toward the industrial freezer doors at the back of the store. They loomed ahead like two great metal giants, silent and imposing. The air around them felt colder, sharper, like it carried a hidden menace. Shaq could almost hear the sound of his own breath as he approached the doors, the icy air seeping through the cracks in the walls, chilling him to his bones. He stepped forward, the sound of his boots crunching on the tile reverberating through the empty aisles. Nora was still at his side, walking briskly, but with a caution that Shaw couldn't blame her, for she had no idea what they would find. Beyond those doors, and neither did he. The lights overhead flickered again, casting unsettling shadows across the store, or the flickering seemed to, grow more frequent. The closer they got to the freezers, the dim light seemed to amplify the chill in the air, sending a shiver down Shaw's spine as he reached the thick metal door. His hand hovered over the handle, hesitating for only a moment before he grabbed draw it and pulled. The door creaked loudly as it swung open, and a wave of cold, almost unnatural air flooded out into the hallway. Shaq instinctively stepped back, a cold gust of wind biting through his coat. But he didn't hesitate. He knew what he had to do. "Nora, stay right here," Shaq said firmly, though his gut churned at the thought of leaving her alone. The child was already in danger, and he couldn't afford to take any chances, but she nodded, her face taut with anxiety, and Shaq could see how hard it was for her to let go of his side. He stepped into the freezer, the cold hitting him like a slap to the face. The floor was slick with frost, and the shelves stacked high with frozen meats and vegetables looked like walls in a labyrinth. The hum of the freezer's machinery was a constant low roar in the background, almost drowning out the sound of Shaq's breath as he moved deeper into the cold. His fingers tightened around his jacket, and he felt his own breath fog up in front of him. The darkness inside the freezer was oppressive. The shadows playing tricks on his mind, he forced himself to stay focused, ignoring the way his breath fogged in the cold air, ignoring the way his body wanted to freeze up with the chill. He needed to find Nora's mother. And fast. The aisles between the towering stacks of boxes and frozen goods felt endless. Shaw moved, quickly, his eyes scanning every inch of the freezer as he walked deeper into the cold. Something caught his eye, or a small, discarded object half hidden beneath a stack of boxes. He knelt down, his fingers brushing against the cold metal of the freezer shelves as he retrieved a phone. It was shattered. The screen cracked in several places, and yet the phone was still warm to the T-Shaq's heart. Sank. It wasn't just any phone. It was the one Lila had pointed out earlier, her mother's phone. The woman had been here, and the fact that her phone had been discarded in the freezer was not a good sign. Shaq knew that. In his gut, Nora's trembling voice interrupted his thoughts. "That's Mommy's phone," she whispered from the doorway. Shaw glanced up, finding her standing just outside the freezer, her face pale and anxious. "I know, Lila," Shaq said softly, trying to reassure her, "but we're not leaving here without her, all right?" Lila nodded, but the fear in her eyes was still there. It was the kind of fear that gnawed at the soul, a fear that went deeper than just, losing a loved one. It was the fear of something far darker, something that couldn't be easily explained. Shaw stood up, shoving the phone into his pocket. He had to keep moving, every second counted. He turned toward the back of the freezer, where a faint light flickered under a pile of boxes. A soft, almost imperceptible sound floated through the thick air. The faint sound of someone gasping. Shaw froze, his heart pounding. That was no animal. No, accidental noise. Someone was here. "Lila, stay right there." Shaq set his voice a low murmur as he moved forward cautiously. He wasn't sure what he was about to find, but he knew he couldn't risk anything. He approached the sound each step, taking him deeper into the cold. He rounded the corner, and there, tied to a chair in the far corner of the freezer, was Nora's mother. She was gagged, her hands bound tightly behind her back. Her eyes were wide with terror, her body trembling with fear, but she was alive. The sight of her cold and shaking, but still breathing, filled Shaq with both relief and fury. Without thinking, he moved quickly toward her, his hands pulling at the ropes that bound her. She gasped as he cut the ropes with a small knife he always carried, and in a flash her arms were free. She lunged toward him, her face streaked with tears, her breath shaky as she finally managed to speak. "Please, please help me." She begged, her voice hoarse. Shaq didn't waste any time. He wrapped his arms around Nora's, mother pulling her into his protective embrace. As he looked over his shoulder to check if Nora was safe, the child was still by the doorway, her eyes wide with shock and relief. "We're not leaving yet," Shaq muttered, glancing around the room. They weren't safe yet, not by a long shot. The man who had done this was still out there. Shaq could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, and as he held Nora's mother, who trembled in his arms, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were still far from safe. There was no time to relax, the fear in Nora's eyes. The way her mother had been so brutally restrained told Shaq that whoever was behind this wasn't going to stop now, not until they got what they wanted. The freezing cold of the industrial freezer wrapped around them like a suffocating blanket. But Shaq didn't care. He couldn't focus on the cold, the isolation, or the low hum of the freezer's machinery. He had a mission, and that mission was to get Nora's mother to safety and to put an end to the nightmare that had unfolded in the small, desolate supermarket. Shaq gently helped Nora's mother to her feet, wrapping his arm around her waist as she stumbled, weak and disoriented. She was clearly exhausted, her eyes bloodshot from crying, her lips chapped from the cold, but she was alive, and that was enough for now. "Lila, come here." Shaq called, his voice softer than before. Trying to reassure the girl, the child stepped forward hesitantly, looking up at Shaq with a mixture of fear and relief. "She's okay," Shaq said, giving Lila a quick, comforting smile. "Your mom is okay now." Lila clung to her mother's side, and the two shared a moment of silent understanding, a bond forged in fear and survival. She didn't need to say anything more. They both knew the danger wasn't over. "We have to move," Shuk said, his voice low and filled with urgency. He didn't know how much time they had. Before the man who had taken Nora's mother came looking for them, he was already certain they were being watched, that every movement they made was being tracked. The situation was more complicated than just a missing person. This was a calculated, premeditated abduction. The whole store seemed to be involved in some way. Sierra Miguel Trevor, and the man who had taken Nora's mother, was still out there. Shaq turned toward the freezer door, but before he could even make it a step, he felt a hand on his arm. "I know who he is," Nora's mother whispered, her voice shaky but clear. Shaw's heart skipped a beat. The woman was gasping for air, clearly trying to calm herself, but her words caught him off guard. "He was here." She continued, her voice trembling with fear. "He works here. He's one of the delivery guys. His name's Rick Malone. He's the one who took me." Shaw's mind raced as he processed the information. Rick Malone. The name matched the man they had been talking about earlier, the man with the burn scar on his neck. But why hadn't anyone else in the store mentioned Rick Malone's name? Why hadn't they said anything? About him, there was something deeper going on here, something far more sinister than Shaq had originally thought. "Where is he?" Shaq asked, his voice sharp and urgent. "Where can I find him?" Nora's mother closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady her breathing. "He's been coming here for months. He's part of the delivery crew, but I think he's been working with someone else, someone higher up." Shaq's eyes narrowed. Who's he working with?" She shook her head slowly, as if struggling to recall. "The details I don't know, but it's not just him. He's been acting strange lately, telling me not to talk to anyone, to stay quiet. He knew things about me, things no one should know." Shaq's stomach churned at the thought. Whoever Rick Malone was working with, they had planned the subduction with chilling precision. He was no ordinary delivery man. Did he say anything about why Shia pressed? Why did he take you? What did he want? Nora's mother hesitated, her eyes distant as she tried to gather her thoughts. She looked down at Lila, and for a moment the two of them just stood there, exchanging a silent conversation. Only they could understand. He didn't want money. Nora's mother finally said, her voice thick with emotion. He said it was because of me, because of something I'd seen, something I knew, but it didn't. I didn't understand what he meant. She felt a chill crawl up his spine. Whatever it was that Nora's mother had witnessed, whatever Rick Malone was trying to keep hidden, it was bigger than just a simple kidnapping. I think we need to get to the manager's office, Shaq said, determination settling into his voice. If Rick Malone was part of the delivery crew, and if he had inside help, then the manager, Mr. Caldwell, had to know something. It was time to confront him. Shaq motioned for Lila and her mother to follow him as he moved toward the back hallway. He knew they had to be careful. Rick Malone could be anywhere waiting for them to slip up, but they couldn't stay in the freezer any longer. They had to make their move as they walked toward the manager's office. Shaq's mind raced with the new information. Rick Malone had been working with someone in the store, someone who was pulling the strings. Behind the scenes, the question was who and what was the real reason behind this abduction. When they reached the manager's office, Shaw knocked firmly on the door. There was a slight pause before Mr. Caldwell. His voice came through the door, sounding annoyed. "What now?" Shaw pushed the door open without waiting for a response. He didn't have time for it. "Pleasantries, we need to talk," he said, his voice hard and unyielding now. Mr. Caldwell was standing behind his desk, looking surprised at Shaq's abrupt entrance. "What's this about?" Mr. Caldwell asked, frowning. "We know about Rick Malone," Shaq said bluntly. "We know what he's been doing, and we need to know what you know about him." Mr. Caldwell's eyes widened, and for the first time, Shaq saw a flicker of fear in the manager's eyes. He knew something, and that knowledge could be the key to everything. "He's just a delivery guy, mister," Caldwell stammered. "He's been here for a while, but I didn't know anything about this here. Shaw wasn't buying it. Who's he working with? Who else is involved?" Mr. Caldwell opened his mouth to speak, but then stopped, his face pale. He glanced at the door like he was considering his options. Shaq leaned in, his voice cold. "Tell me the truth, Mr. Caldwell. Who else is in on this, Mr.?" Caldwell took a shaky breath, then in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "It's not just Rick Malone. There's someone higher up, someone who runs the delivery service, someone who's been paying him." Shaq's heart skipped a beat. "Who, Mr.?" Caldwell's face went ash. "And I don't know, I just do my job, okay? But I'm telling you, you're in danger. We all are." The pieces were finally starting to fit together. But the question still lingered, and now, more than ever, Shaq knew that finding out who was behind this, who was pulling the strings, was the only way to stop the madness. The air in the manager's office was thick with tension as Shaq stood over Mr. Caldwell, who was visibly sweating, his hand trembling as he gripped the edge of his desk. Nora's mother was still clutching her daughter, her face pale and worn from the ordeal, but her eyes were filled with a fire, a determination that matched Ja's own. The situation was escalating quickly, and they were running out of time. Whoever was behind this knew they were getting close. Shaq's mind was racing. The name Rick Malone was becoming less and less of a standalone clue. The mention of someone, higher up, someone running the Del Reservis, made his blood run cold. This wasn't just a simple kidnapping. It was an operation, something carefully orchestrated by people who had access, who could move behind the scenes without drawing attention. Mr. Caldwell's refusal to give a straight answer, his defensive posture, told Shaq that he knew more than he was letting on. He couldn't afford to waste any more time here. "I don't have time for games, mister." Caldwell, Shaq said, his voice as cold as the freezer that had just left. "You're going to lock this place down now, mister." Caldwell's eyes widened in panic. "What do you mean?" "Lock it down." His voice cracked under the pressure. "What are you talking about? This is just a misunderstanding." "Rick Malone wouldn't," Shaq cut him off with a sharp gesture. "I don't care about Rick Malone's excuses right now. I need you to make sure no one leaves the store until we figure out what's going on." "No one, you understand, mister." Caldwell stammered for a moment, clearly torn, but Shaq's unwavering stare cut through the indecision. He saw the shift in Mr. Caldwell's expression, a faint flicker of realization. Mr. Caldwell wasn't as clueless as he had pretended to be. He was part of something bigger, something he couldn't avoid, and now he had no choice but to cooperate. With a heavy sigh, "Mister," Caldwell stood up, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for the store's walkie-talkie. Fine. He muttered, his voice thin. But I'm telling you, you're making a big mistake. I don't care. Shaq replied, his tone hard. Do it, mister. Caldwell hesitated, looking briefly at Nora's mother, then back to Shaq before finally pressing the button on the walkie-talkie. Attention all employees, he said, his voice wavering over the loudspeaker. We're going into lockdown. No one leaves the store until further notice. This is not a drill. Repeat. This is not a drill. Stay in place. Shaq turned and glanced at Nork's mother. Her eyes were wide, her grip tightening on her daughter's shoulder as they both looked at the manager, a mix of confusion and fear in their expressions. What are you doing? She asked softly, her voice raw with emotion. What's going on? I'm trying to protect you, Shaq said, his voice soft but resolute. We're not letting anyone walk out of here until we get some answers. I know something's wrong with this place and I won't let it go until we figure it out, mister. Caldwell gave him a wary look, but said nothing more. He looked like a man who had seen too much, but not enough to know how to fix it. Shaq wasn't waiting for him to figure things out. The danger was too real, and the time to act was now. As they exited the manager's office, Shaq couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. Every passing moment felt like a step closer to the unknown. He was certain they were being watched. The oppressive silence of the store felt more like a trap than a sanctuary. Now I'm going to head to the security room, Shaq said, turning to Mr. Caldwell. You stay with them. If anything happens, you make sure no one gets out. Got it, mister? Caldwell nodded, though the fear in his eyes was palpable. Got it, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Didn't waste another second. He turned, had made his way toward the back of the store. He could feel his pulse. Quicken the urgency of the situation pressing against his chest. They needed more information. They needed to know who else was involved, and they needed to track Rick Malone down before he vanished into the shadows. The walk to the security office felt like an eternity. Every corner seemed to hide a new threat, every flicker of light making Shaq's second guess his every move. But he knew he had no choice but to push forward. Nora's mother was safe for now, but they weren't out of the woods yet. When Shaq reached the security office, he found the door locked. A single light flickered from inside, casting long shadows across the hallway. He tried the handle locked. He knocked twice, not hard. Who's there? Came a voice from the other side. Shaw recognized it immediately. It was. Trevor, it's ya open up, he demanded. There was a long pause before the door unlocked, and Trevor cracked it open just wide enough to peek through. Man, I told you, Trevor started, his voice defensive. I'm not involved in whatever this is, I'm just doing my job. I don't care, Shaq snapped. We've got a bigger problem than you know. Open the door. Trevor sighed, but stepped aside reluctantly. Letting Shaq enter the security room was small, cluttered with monitors showing various angles of the store. The quiet hum of the machinery in the background felt like a ticking clock, each second slipping by faster than the last. Shaq walked straight to the control panel, scanning the screens for anything that could give them an edge. He quickly pressed a button to pull up the security footage, his eyes flicking over each monitor or searching for any clue that could connect the dots. He was moving fast. Now, not wasting a moment. The footage showed the entrance, the aisles, the stockroom, but there was one frame that stopped him in his tracks. It was a blurry shot from the freezer section. A man was walking towards the door, pushing a dolly laden with boxes, his back to the camera, but something in the footage caught Shaq's eye, the unmistakable burn scar on the man's neck. That's him, Shaw muttered under his breath. Rick Malone, the footage played out, showing the man moving with precision as if he knew exactly what he was doing. He never signed out. He never looked back. It was all part of the plan, and he wasn't alone. Shay pointed at the screen, and we need to find out who else was with him. Look for anyone who might be connected. Trevor's eyes widened as he watched the footage. I don't know anything, man. But if that's Rick Malone, he's been acting weird for weeks, always coming in, but never really doing much. He wasn't even supposed to be here tonight. Then why was he? Shah demanded, the tension in his voice. Rising, who was he meeting? Trevor shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the monitors. I don't know, but I saw him talking to Mr. Caldwell earlier. They were in the back office. Whispering, Shaq's eyes narrowed. Mr. Caldwell again. He wasn't innocent in all of this. We need to move. Shaq said quickly, turning back to Trevor. Where are the exits? Trevor hesitated, but pointed toward the rear door. There's one in the back, but it's locked down now. No one's getting out unless Mr. Caldwell says so. Good, Shaq said, a plan forming in his mind. We're going to make sure they don't escape. Stay here. I'll be back. Shaq moved quickly through the security room, his mind still buzzing with questions that seemed to multiply with every second that passed. He had a feeling they were getting closer to the truth, but every new revelation only deepened the mystery. Rick Malone was just a cog in a much larger machine, and Shaq wasn't going to let it grind anyone else under its wheels, as he left the security room. The dim lighting of the supermarket seemed to press in on him, and the silence around him was unnerving. The cold, still air in the store, thickened by the storm outside, added to the sense of unease. Shu's senses were heightened, every footstep loud against the quiet, every creak of the floorboards seeming to echo like a warning. The supermarket was no longer the familiar, comforting place it had once been. It was a trap. He made his way to the back of the store where the freezer section loomed. He needed answers, and he wasn't leaving without them. Mr. Caldwell had been hiding something. Shaq was sure of it now. Whether he was involved directly or just a pawn in something bigger, Mr. Caldwell's knowledge of Rick Malone and the delivery crew was key to unraveling what had happened. The back storage area behind the freezer was where Shaq was headed. Now this place felt like a forgotten corner of the store, tucked away from public view. The workers rarely went back here unless there was something to be done, something hidden in to keep out of sight, and Shaq could feel it now in his gut. The sense that something was off, something more than just an abduction. The door to the back storage area was locked, a heavy steel thing that looked like it hadn't been touched in ages. She knew Mr. Caldwell would never have left it unlocked if he thought it might give away the secrets the store was hiding, but Shaq wasn't about to waste time on locked doors. With a swift motion, he kicked at the door, the force of his boot making it shudder violently before it gave way with a loud bang echoing through the quiet store. Inside, the air was colder than the rest of the store. The lights were dim, and the room had a musty, stagnant smell. Stacked high against the walls were large, rusted metal. Shelves filled with boxes and various supplies, some of which looked to be there for years, and a faint humming from the industrial freezers next door was the only sound that broke the silence. Shaq's eyes scanned the room, his instincts telling him that someone was hiding back here. The room didn't look like it belonged in a supermarket. It was a place for storage. Yes, but it was too cluttered, too neglected. The shelves were overstuffed as if they were hiding something that didn't belong. He stepped further into the room, cautiously looking around as he walked deeper. Something caught his attention. The back corner of the room was more sparsely populated with boxes, a small gap between the shelves revealing something unusual. A door unlike the rest of the storage area. This door seemed newer, cleaner, as if it had been installed recently. It was clearly not part of the original layout of the store. Shaq's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the hidden room. He moved towards the door and found that it was locked, but only with a small latch on the outside. He pressed against the door, trying to feel for any give, and when he found none, he put his shoulder into it. With a loud crack, the door swung open, revealing the room. Beyond inside, the air was even colder, the kind of cold that sunk into your bones and made your teeth ache. The walls were lined with more shelves, some filled with equipment. Shaq couldn't immediately identify others with more boxes. The space was small, cramped with barely enough room to turn around, and then he saw her. Nora's mother was sitting in the middle of the room, bound to a chair. her hands tied tightly behind her back with thick rope. A piece of cloth was shoved into her mouth, gagging her. The chair she was tied to was a stark contrast to the other makeshift furniture in the room, clean, and standing in sharp contrast to the rest of the dirty, cluttered surroundings. She looked like a prisoner, and the sight of her weak but alive sent a rush of anger through Shaq. He couldn't let this go on. Not now, not ever. He moved toward her, kneeling down to inspect her bindings. The ropes were tight, but not enough to break her. Her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. But she was still breathing, still alive. He could see the fear in her eyes as they locked onto his familiar, relieved fear. She knew who he was, but she was still unsure whether or not she could trust him completely after everything she'd been through. Shaq didn't blame her. Hey, he whispered, trying to keep his voice soft. It's okay. I'm here to get you out of here. Her eyes widened slightly at his words, and she nodded, though her eyes darted toward the door as behind him, Shaq felt a jolt of adrenaline. Was someone coming? Had they been spotted? It's all right, Shaq reassured her carefully, reaching to cut the ropes around her wrists. The knife in his pocket was sharp, and it made quick work of the thick ropes that had held her for so long. As he cut the last rope, he heard a faint noise from behind him. The sound of a distant footstep. It wasn't a full step. It was soft, deliberate. Shaq froze, holding his breath. He quickly turned to face the sound. But there was nothing, just the soft, echoing hum of the freezer. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, and he knew they didn't have much time before the person responsible returned. "Listen to me," Shaq said, leaning in close to Nora's mother as he helped her to her feet. "We need to move fast. Someone's going to come looking for you. I'm going to get you both out of here, but you need to trust me." Her eyes met his, filled with a mixture of fear and hope. "Who?" she whispered. The voice muffled by the gag. She seemed to be asking about the man behind all of this, but Shaq wasn't sure if he had the answers yet. All he knew was that Rick Malone was involved, and in that Mr. Caldwell was lying about something. Someone high up was pulling the strings, but Shaq hadn't figured out who. "Yet we're not done yet," Shaq muttered, glancing toward the door. "Stay close. We need to find out who else is involved." Nora's mother nodded, her face pale, but determined. She was a survivor, and she wasn't going down without a fight. Shaq could see it in her eyes with a final glance around the room. Shaq motioned for her to follow. He wasn't about to leave this place until he had answers, and he wasn't going to let anyone hurt these two again. The fluorescent lights above flickered as Shaq helped Nora's mother to her feet, studying her with one hand while keeping a sharp eye on the door. His heart was pounding, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Every second they spent in this hidden room felt like a ticking time bomb. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone, maybe Rick Malone himself, was already on their trail. They didn't have much time before the real danger arrived. "Stay close," Shaq murmured, his voice low but firm. Nora's mother, the weak and shaken, nodded. Shaq could feel her trembling, not just from the cold but from fear of being discovered, of being dragged back into that dark room. He didn't blame her. She had been through hell already. The hidden room was tight, and Shaq knew they couldn't have afforded to linger much longer. The store was large, but every corner seemed to hide something, some kind of danger waiting for them. If they were going to get out, they had to do it. Now Shaq carefully guided Nora's mother back toward the door, trying to make as little noise as possible. Lila followed them, her small frame shivering from the cold and the tension in the air. Shaq could feel his instincts sharpening with every step, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on, and something wasn't right. They were being watched. He could feel it, and it wasn't just the fear that clouded his mind. The hallway outside the hidden room felt almost suffocating. Shaw's eyes darted back and forth, scanning every inch for any sign of movement. He could hear the faint shuffle of footsteps behind them. Someone was moving, and it didn't sound like they were being sneaky about it. They reached the main hallway of the store, and Shaq paused for a moment, listening. The low hum of the freezers and the quiet murmur of the store's air conditioning system were the only sounds that filled the space. It was too quiet, and the store should have been bustling with activity at least. It should have been when the snowstorm wasn't closing in on the town, but now it felt like a ghost town. As Shaq stepped forward, his senses were on high alert. They were nearing the front of the store when a faint sound from behind them caught his attention. A door had opened somewhere soft, almost imperceptible. Shaq's instincts screamed at him to move faster to get out of sight before they were discovered. But it was too late. Shaq's eyes flickered toward the front of the store, and there, he was a man moving toward the exit. Head lowered, a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He was dressed in a delivery jacket, his neck partially obscured by a scarf, but the burn scar that peeked out from under his collar was unmistakable. It was Rick Malone. Shaq's pulse quickened. There was no mistaking it now. Rick Malone was trying to slip away to vanish before anyone could stop him. He had been working under the radar, and now it seemed like he was making his escape. But Shaq wasn't about to let him slip away, not after everything that had happened. "Stay behind me," Shaq whispered to Nora and her mother, his voice calm but urgent. He knew they didn't have time to waste. He needed to act fast if Rick Malone got away. Now they might never catch him, and the truth would remain buried. Shaq moved toward the front of the store, his heavy boots making almost no sound against the floor. His mind was focused entirely on Rick Malone. He needed to intercept him before the delivery man disappeared. Into the night, out of reach, out of sight. But he had to be careful. Rick Malone was dangerous, and Shaq knew he wouldn't go down easily. The closer Shaq got, the more the tension built. Rick Malone was just a few yards away now, almost to the automatic doors that led to the parking lot. Shaq's mind raced through the possibilities. Should he confront him now, or should he wait until he was outside, away from the watchful eyes of the store? But before he could make a decision, Rick Malone turned slightly. Of glancing over his shoulder as if he sensed something was wrong, Shaq's heart stopped for a moment. There was no time left to wait. In one swift movement, Shaq sprinted forward, covering the ground between them in seconds. Rick Malone's eyes widened in surprise, but by then it was too late. Shaq reached him just as he was about to step outside, grabbing him by the shoulder and spinning him around, going somewhere. Rick Malone. Shaq's voice was low, a dangerous growl that made the delivery man freeze. In place, Rick Malone's eyes widened in shock, then narrowed into something darker, something full of menace. His lips curled into a sneer as he took a step back, trying to shake off Shaq's grip. "You don't know who you're ming with," Rick Malone spat, his voice filled with venom. Shaq didn't flinch. His grip tightened, and he shoved Rick Malone back into the store, forcing him to stumble. "I know exactly who you are, and I know exactly what you have been doing." Rick Malone, his face twisted with anger. But Shaw wasn't done. He wasn't going to let this man intimidate him. "I know about Nora's mom. I know about the freezer. I know you've been helping someone run this show from the inside." The delivery man's eyes darted toward the exit as if he was weighing his options, trying to figure out a way to escape. But Sheik was standing in his way now, and there was no going around him. "Who else is involved?" Shah demanded, his voice growing harder with each word. "Who's behind this? Who's pulling the strings, Rick?" Malone let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "You really think I'm going to tell you you've got no idea what you're getting yourself into?" Before Shaq could respond, Rick Malone made a sudden move. His elbow shot out, aiming for Shaq's gut. It was a cheap shot, but it landed. Schick grunted, stumbling back for a moment. But he wasn't going to let Rick Malone get away that easily. He surged forward, slamming Rick Malone into the nearby shelving unit. The shelves rattled, but the store stayed eerily silent. Shaw's face was inches from Rick Malone. "Now tell me what I need to know, and maybe you'll walk out of here. Otherwise, I'll let the cops handle it." Eddie's face twisted into a snarl, but just as he opened his mouth to retort, the sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder by the second the police were getting closer. Shaw's heart skipped a beat. "Oh, you're not going anywhere." Shaq said, his voice calm but filled with steel. He wasn't going to let Rick Malone slip away now. Just then, the front door swung open and officers burst into the store. Shaq stepped aside, letting them take control. Rick Malone didn't fight them. He didn't have the chance. Two officers grabbed him, cuffing him quickly and efficiently as Rick Malone cursed under his breath. Shaq watched as they dragged him toward the door. But just before he was escorted out, Rick Malone turned his head and gave Shaq a twisted smile. "Ah, you don't know what you're up against, none of you do," but Shaw wasn't worried about Rick. Malone's cryptic warning, he had the answers he needed, and now the real work would begin. The storm was far from over, but Shaq knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to stop until the entire truth was exposed. The snowstorm that had been swirling outside for hours finally showed no signs of slowing down. The once quiet town of Black On was blanketed in a thick, heavy coat of white, the swirling flakes now reduced to an endless blur of snow and ice inside the supermarket. However, the storm seemed distant at the chaos, the fear, the desperation. It all felt like a lifetime ago, even though it had only been hours since Shaq had stepped into the store outside. The flashing lights of the police cars cast an eerie glow against the falling snow. Officers moved quickly, their breath visible in the frigid air as they worked to wrap up the situation. Rick Malone had been apprehended. And as the last of the officers left the scene, Shaq found himself standing in the parking lot, his eyes fixed on the reunion between Lila and her mother. They were wrapped in thick blankets, now huddling together against the cold, as if the warmth from their embrace was the only thing that could truly shield them from what had happened inside the store. Nora's mother, her face streaked with tears but filled with gratitude, held her daughter close, whispering words of comfort that Shaq couldn't hear but could feel in the quiet air. Shu stood at a distance watching them. He knew they had been through hell. And yet, in that moment, they had something far more valuable than the cold could ever take away from them. Their lives and the bond between them that no one could sever. The police had already taken Rick Malone away. His arrest, followed by a flood of revelations, the supermarket hidden network, the delivery crew, and the sinister operations pulling the strings, were all coming to light. Mr. Caldwell, the manager, had been complicit in the scheme, and whether out of fear or greed, O'Shea still didn't know, but he did know that Mr. Caldwell's role in all of this was now in the hands of the authorities, who would investigate his connection to Rick Malone in the larger conspiracy. And then there was the larger question: who had been behind it all, who had masterminded the entire operation that had almost led to Nora's mother's death? Shaq didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew that Rick Malone was just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. There was a network, and it would unravel in time. For now, though, the storm outside seemed like a fitting end to the chaos that had engulfed them. The worst was over. Shaq turned back toward the small group of officers still milling around near the front doors of the store. One of them, a tall officer with a clipboard, waved him over. Shaw nodded and approached him. "Everything's clear?" Shaq asked, his voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. "Yay, we've got Rick Malone in custody, and Mr. Caldwell has been taken in for questioning. The rest of the employees are giving statements. We've got a lot of follow-up work to do, but we've got it from here." Shaq nodded, his thoughts drifting back to Lila and her mother. Good. Just make sure they're both safe. They've been through enough." The officer gave a brief understanding nod before turning away to speak with another officer. Shaw lingered for a moment longer, taking a deep breath as he looked up at the snow falling from the sky. It was silent. Now the kind of silence that settled in after a storm had passed, empty but full of possibility. The tension that had gripped the supermarket was gone, replaced by the quiet calm of the aftermath. He walked back toward Lila and her mother, whose faces brightened as they saw him approach. "Thank you." Nora's mother said, her voice breaking slightly with emotion. "I don't know how we'll ever repay you for what you did." Shaq gave a small smile, his voice steady but warm. You don't owe me anything, you and your daughter. You're safe now, and that's what matters. Lila, holding her mother's hand, looked up at Shaq with wide eyes, her innocent face filled with gratitude. You saved us. She whispered, her voice soft but sincere. Shock crouched down to meet her gaze. I didn't do it alone, he said, his voice gentle but firm. You and your mom were strong. You got through this together. That's what really matters. Nora's mother wrapped her arms around her daughter, pulling her into a tight embrace. They both seemed to find comfort in the warmth they shared, the kind of warmth that had been absent when the terror of the situation had taken hold. Shaq stood back for a moment, letting them have their time. His work here was done. The nightmare had ended, and though there were still loose ends to tie up, he knew that for Lila and her mother there would be peace, at least for now. As the night wore on, the snow began to fall heavier, blanketing the town in white. It felt like a new beginning, a clean slate after everything that had happened. Shaq had a feeling that no matter how long it took, the truth would eventually come out. Rick Malone might be locked up, but the operation he was a part of had its roots in something far deeper. And sooner or later, the pieces would fall into place. Shaw turned and made his way toward his car, ready to leave the store behind. The sound of Nora's mother and daughter talking quietly, the soft sound of laughter that followed, reminded him of the importance of what had just happened. Not every battle was fought with fists or violence. Sometimes it took more than that. It took the courage to stand up, to follow the clues, to trust your instincts, even when the world around you seemed to fall apart. The storm had passed, but the lesson lingered even in the most ordinary places. Extraordinary courage could change lives. A Shaq got into his car and started the engine. The warmth of the heat. Peter surrounded him, but it was the warmth of knowing that he had done something good, something real, and that filled him up more than anything else. He had helped give a mother and daughter back their lives, and that was enough. Before driving off, Shaw glanced back at the supermarket. The lights inside flickered, and through the front window, he saw Nora and her mother still huddled together. They would be all right. They had each other, and that he thought was all that really mattered, or even in the most ordinary places. Extraordinary courage can change lives. If this story moved, you hit like, subscribe, and share this video, because someone out there needs to know kindness still exists. In the end, it wasn't just about a rescue. It was about seeing what others chose to ignore, and choosing to act when silence was easier. Marcus Dean didn't wear a badge or carry a title, but that night he embodied something. We all have the capacity for courage rooted in compassion. Because sometimes all it takes is one person to follow a cry no one else hears, and change everything. But now we want to hear from you. Do you believe that more people should intervene when something feels off, or is it too risky in today's world? Should employees like Trevor and Sierra be held accountable for their silence? Or were they victims of fear too? If this story moved, you don't forget to drop your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to Soulful Stories of Fu, where real moments like this remind us of the power we all hold. To stand up, speak out, and protect those who can't. Because the next story could be yours.